Imagine France of 1920s under World War II. For decades, the history books told us her greatest weapon was her glamour, a mesmerizing entertainer who captured the heart of Europe. But beneath the silk and the spotlight, she was hiding a lethal secret.
Paris, 1940. The City of Light has just been smothered by the swastika. While the rest of the world watched the Eiffel Tower fall under the shadow of a fascist empire, a beautiful woman was seen laughing in a brightly lit Parisian cabaret, clinking crystal champagne glasses with high-ranking Nazi officers. History books often paint the elite entertainers of occupied Paris as cowards, wealthy, detached celebrities who used their fame and fortune to cozy up to the invaders, doing whatever it took to save their own skin and keep their champagne flowing. And for the first few months of the German occupation, that is exactly what the world thought of Josephine Baker. They whispered that she was a sympathizer, a traitor, a woman who had traded her soul for a spotlight. But they were dead wrong. While the Gestapo was busy watching her hips, they never noticed the invisible ink drying on her sheet music. Josephine Baker wasn't just the most famous woman in the world, she was the most dangerous woman in France. This is the story of how a girl born in a cardboard box became the Nazis' worst nightmare. Josephine Baker was a woman who lived 1,000 lives, but the one she kept hidden from the Nazis is the one that changed the course of the Second World War. Before we step into the freezing, violent slums of St. Louis to see exactly where this fire started, I have a question for you. If you were in her shoes, armed with unparalleled global fame, endless fortune, and a guaranteed ticket to safety in America, would you risk being tortured to death for a country that wasn't even yours? Hold that thought. We are going deep into the shadows today. If you are a fan of the psychological thrillers that history tried to bury, make sure you are tuned in. Let's begin. To understand why Josephine Baker was not afraid of the Gestapo, you have to understand the absolute hell she had already survived. She was born into a war zone, not a war of nations, but a war of starvation, systemic violence, and survival. The year was 1906, St. Louis, Missouri. Her house was little more than a cardboard shack. Her dinner was whatever she could scavenge from the trash cans behind the homes of the wealthy. But poverty wasn't the only monster at the door. When Josephine was just 11 years old, she witnessed the East St. Louis race riots of 1917. She watched from a bridge as entire neighborhoods were burned to the ground by white mobs. She saw refugees fleeing for their lives, their homes reduced to ash. That horrific violence burned itself into her psychology. It taught her a chilling lesson early on. The world is incredibly dangerous, and no one is coming to save you. By the time she was 8 years old, she had already been sent out to work as a live-in domestic servant for wealthy white families. These families treated her worse than their livestock. One employer intentionally plunged Josephine's hands into boiling hot water as a punishment for putting too much soap in the laundry. She was trapped, penniless, abused. But Josephine had a secret weapon: her feet. She began dancing on street corners in the freezing cold just to earn pennies for food. When her cheap shoes wore completely through and the rough concrete of the streets of St. Louis made her bare feet bleed, she simply kept dancing. Most people assume that talent is what gets you out of the gutter. It isn't. Spite does. Spite and a radical refusal to be broken by a world that hates you. At 13, she decided she was done being a victim. She hunted down a local vaudeville manager. She asked for a job. He looked at the ragged girl and said no. She showed up again the next day. He said no. She slept in the alleyway behind the theater so she could ask him the moment he arrived. Eventually, he gave her a background role just to make her stop staring at him. That tiny crack in the door led to a traveling troupe, which led to New York City. But America in the 1920s did not want a black superstar. They wanted her to wear blackface and play the fool. Josephine looked at the ceiling America had built for her, and she realized that if she stayed in the land of the free, she would die in a cage. So at 19 years old, she took the biggest gamble of her life. She bought a one-way ticket across the Atlantic Ocean. When Josephine stepped off the boat in Paris in 1925, she had nothing but a winter coat, a few dollars, and a desperate dream. She didn't speak a word of French. She had no safety net. But within 1 month of arriving, she was the highest-paid, most talked-about entertainer on the European continent. She walked onto the stage of the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées wearing nothing but a string of artificial bananas around her waist. It was scandalous. It was electric. It was pure, unadulterated freedom. The French had never seen anything like her. The energy she brought wasn't just a dance, it was a physical manifestation of liberation. Paris fell into a collective obsession. Pablo Picasso painted her image. Ernest Hemingway drank with her in Parisian cafes and declared her the most sensational woman anybody ever saw, or ever will. Her wealth exploded overnight. She bought a massive French chateau called Les Milandes. She owned a pet cheetah named Chiquita, whom she adorned with a diamond-encrusted collar. Josephine would casually walk Chiquita down the Champs-Élysées, sometimes bringing the massive jungle cat into the orchestra pit during her performances, terrifying the musicians and delighting the crowds. She was no longer the bleeding girl from the St. Louis slums. She was a goddess. But more importantly than the wealth, France gave her dignity. She learned the language fluently. She became a full French citizen. She was allowed to eat in the finest restaurants, sleep in the finest hotels, and be treated as a human being. Freedoms she was violently denied in her own birth country. She had achieved the impossible. She was safe. But history rarely lets the safe remain comfortable. By 1939, the air in Europe had grown thick and toxic. The drums of war were no longer a distant metaphor. They were a mechanized reality revving its engines at the German border. As the Nazi war machine prepared to swallow France, American expats and French elites panicked. They packed their bags, secured their fortunes, and fled. Josephine Baker had a choice: flee back to America where she would be safe from German bombs but subjected to the humiliating cruelty of Jim Crow, or stay and watch her adopted home burn to the ground. What she did next defied every instinct of self-preservation. In the summer of 1940, the nightmare became reality. Paris fell. The swastika was hoisted over the city. Jacques Audacious, the head of French military intelligence, was watching his country collapse. His networks were fractured. The Gestapo was everywhere. One morning, his office door opened and a woman walked in. He recognized her instantly. Every man in Europe recognized her. Audacious assumed what anyone would assume. The great Josephine Baker was terrified, and she was here to use her fame to beg for a priority exit visa to Lisbon. Instead, Josephine stood completely straight, looked the head of French intelligence dead in the eye, and spoke a sentence that would change history. "France made me what I am," she said. "The Parisians gave me their hearts, and I am ready to give them my life." Audacious was stunned. It was a beautiful, patriotic sentiment, but practically speaking, it was absurd. He was running a ghost war. He needed spies who could blend into the gray walls of occupied Paris. He needed people who were entirely forgettable. Josephine Baker was the most photographed, vibrant, and recognizable face on the entire continent. How could she possibly operate in the shadows? Then the trap door opened in Abte's mind. He realized her fame was not a liability, it was the ultimate, impenetrable disguise. The Nazis were blinded by their own arrogance and deeply ingrained prejudices. They viewed her as nothing more than a beautiful, shallow entertainer, a dancer who only cared about champagne and applause. Josephine weaponized their sexism and racism against them. While other spies were sneaking through muddy alleys in the dead of night, Josephine would walk right through the front door of the German command. She began attending elite embassy parties. She would smile her dazzling smile, pour champagne for high-ranking Italian bureaucrats and German officers, and let them brag about their military operations just to impress the famous dancer. They thought she wasn't smart enough to understand what they were saying. They were wrong. Behind her smiling eyes, Josephine possessed a photographic memory. She would listen to their drunken boasting, memorize exact troop movements, harbor defenses, and strategic plans, and then politely excuse herself to the powder room to write the details down on the palms of her hands. Gathering the intelligence was only the first step. The true terror was smuggling it out. Imagine for a moment the sheer psychological pressure. You're standing at a heavily fortified Gestapo checkpoint. The guards are freezing, tired, and under strict orders to execute resistance couriers on the spot. A black limousine pulls up to the post. The window rolls down. Inside is Josephine Baker. The hardened Nazi guards are suddenly starstruck. They stumble over their words, asking for her autograph. They briefly glance at her luxurious luggage. It is filled with nothing but silk gowns, expensive perfume, and thick stacks of sheet music for her upcoming European tour. They smile, salute, and wave the car through. They just let the most devastating intelligence of the war slip right through their fingers. Those innocent-looking sheets of music were covered in invisible ink. Working with the resistance, Josephine used a specialized chemical compound that vanished when it dried and only reappeared when brushed with a specific solution or exposed to intense heat. Right between the bars of her musical sonatas, she meticulously wrote the exact locations of German airfields, the identities of double agents, and the blueprints of Nazi installations. She traveled freely across Europe to neutral countries like Portugal and Spain, places where other spies would be arrested on sight. When the intelligence was too sensitive for paper, she pinned highly classified photographs of German military bases inside her bra and underwear. When Jacques Abte nervously asked her how she planned to get past the brutal Gestapo checkpoints with classified documents physically strapped to her body, Josephine just laughed. Who, she asked, is going to dare search Josephine Baker to the skin? She was playing a lethal game of hide in plain sight. The psychological toll must have been unimaginable. She had to laugh, perform, and charm the very men who were hunting her colleagues. One slip-up, one suspicious guard with a chemical swab, or one misplaced photograph, and the glamorous dancer would have been dragged into a Gestapo basement, brutally tortured and executed. But she never flinched. By 1941, the heat in Paris was becoming unbearable. The Gestapo was closing in on Abte's network. Josephine was ordered to move her operations to North Africa. Officially, she told the press she was traveling to Morocco to recover from a severe illness. Unofficially, she was building the central nervous system of the Mediterranean resistance. She leveraged her massive personal fortune to fund the network, practically bankrolling the operation herself. She bribed officials and secured forged passports for Jewish citizens fleeing the Holocaust, saving countless lives. But the cover story about her health tragically became a reality. Soon after arriving in Morocco, she contracted a devastating infection that led to peritonitis and sepsis. She became so violently sick she required multiple emergency surgeries. She was dying. Yet even from her deathbed, her commitment to the war effort was terrifying in its intensity. She refused to stop working. She turned her private hospital room in Casablanca into a highly secure meeting place for Allied officers and resistance leaders. While she lay wrapped in bandages, running a dangerously high fever, American and French diplomats would come to her room under the guise of paying their final respects to a dying star. In reality, they were using her room to safely coordinate the logistics for Operation Torch, the massive, pivotal Allied invasion of North Africa. And here is the brilliant, almost unbelievable twist of her Moroccan campaign. Her near-death experience provided the ultimate operational cover. The Nazi informants in the region assumed the great Josephine Baker had been neutralized by nature. They stopped surveilling her hospital room. They assumed she was just a tragic, dying woman. They never suspected for a second that the dying woman coughing in her bed was actively orchestrating the destruction of the Third Reich. When Paris was finally liberated in the late summer of 1944, Josephine Baker did not return to her beloved city wearing a string of pearls, a designer gown, or her famous banana skirt. She returned wearing the crisp, unglamorous military uniform of a sub-lieutenant in the Free French Air Force. She had spent the final brutal months of the war touring the front lines, performing for the exhausted Allied troops in North Africa and the Middle East. But this was not a luxurious celebrity USO tour. Josephine refused the comforts offered to her. She flew in freezing, unpressurized military cargo planes. She slept on cots in muddy tents. She washed her own undergarments in dirty puddles, and she walked through the rubble of freshly bombed cities to bring a few hours of joy to soldiers who knew they might die the next morning. She had entirely shed the skin of the pampered superstar. She was a soldier. The French government recognized exactly what she had sacrificed. When the dust of the war finally settled, General Charles de Gaulle personally authorized her to be awarded the Croix de Guerre and the Legion of Honor, the highest, most prestigious military decorations the nation of France could bestow. She was no longer just an adopted entertainer. She was a certified national hero, a woman who had bled for the soul of the Republic. But as she stood on the balcony of her chateau, her chest heavy with military medals, looking out at a newly freed Europe, she realized something deeply tragic. The war against tyranny wasn't over. The enemy had simply changed uniforms. She looked across the Atlantic Ocean toward her birthplace of America, and she saw the exact same monsters she had just spent 4 agonizing years fighting in Europe. The core ideology of the Third Reich, the belief that one race was genetically superior to another, was alive and well in the United States. Only this time, the perpetrators weren't wearing swastikas. They were wearing tailored suits in government buildings, police badges on their chests, and white hoods in the American South. Josephine realized she had to cross the ocean and face the one enemy she had run away from at 19 years old. In the early 1950s, Josephine Baker returned to the United States to launch a national tour. She was returning as a decorated war hero, a global icon, and a woman of immense wealth. But America did not care. In October of 1951, Josephine walked into the famous Stork Club in New York City with a group of friends. She was dressed impeccably, expecting a quiet dinner. Instead, the waiters completely ignored her. They refused to take her order. They served the white tables around her, leaving the woman who had outsmarted the Gestapo sitting in humiliating silence simply because of the color of her skin. Sitting at a nearby table was a young, rising Hollywood actress named Grace Kelly. Grace saw what was happening, became utterly disgusted, and stood up. She grabbed Josephine's arm, and the two women walked out of the club together in protest, sparking a lifelong friendship. Josephine did not just cry over the incident, she went to war. She decided to weaponize her fame and her bank account. She issued a blanket ultimatum to the biggest, most lucrative nightclubs in Miami, Las Vegas, and New York. I will not perform unless your audience is completely integrated. If you do not let Black patrons walk through the front door, sit in the front row, and drink at the same bar, you do not get Josephine Baker. This was a financial suicide mission. Club owners balked. She was offered astronomical contracts, the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars today, which she flatly turned down. But she didn't just quietly decline the work, she held press conferences exposing the club's racism. This drew the fury of the United States government. The FBI, directed by the ruthless J. Edgar Hoover, opened a massive, heavily classified file on her. Hoover was terrified of her influence. He actively fed rumors to the press that she was a communist sympathizer. The government revoked her work visas, canceled her shows, and subjected her to intense psychological warfare, trying to ruin her reputation and bankrupt her. But Hoover deeply misunderstood the psychology of the woman he was dealing with. How do you intimidate a woman who used to smuggle treasonous documents past Nazi executioners? You cannot. The clubs, bleeding money and desperate for her star power, eventually began to break. She single-handedly forced legendary venues across America to desegregate, simply by withholding her brilliance. August 28, 1963. 250,000 people are gathered around the reflecting pool in Washington, D.C. History primarily remembers this sweltering summer day for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s legendary "I Have a Dream" speech. But history often forgets the woman who spoke right before him. At 57 years old, Josephine Baker walked up to the podium. She did not wear a glamorous designer dress. She did not wear stage makeup. She wore her free French military uniform, her chest heavy with the war medals she had earned dodging bullets in Europe. She was the only official female speaker scheduled that day. She wanted the American public and the government that had targeted her to see exactly what a patriot looked like. She looked out at the massive sea of faces, a mix of young and old, black and white, and she delivered a chilling reality check. "I have walked into the palaces of kings and queens," she said, her voice echoing across the National Mall, "and into the houses of presidents, and much more. But I could not walk into a hotel in America and get a cup of coffee, and that made me mad." She was not there as a celebrity providing an endorsement. She was there as a battle-hardened veteran of the war for human dignity. She told the crowd how she had run away from America as a teenager because she couldn't stand the fear, but that standing before them now, she was no longer afraid. She looked down at the younger generation of civil rights activists, people who were being beaten and jailed for the very things she was fighting for, and she offered them a prophecy. "You are on the eve of a complete victory," she told them. "You can't go wrong. The world is behind you." She was officially passing the torch from a generation that had survived to a generation that was going to conquer. While Josephine fought systemic racism on the public stage, her most radical, audacious rebellion was happening in private. She wanted to prove to the world a psychological hypothesis, that racism is not a natural human instinct, it is a taught behavior. To prove this, she traveled the globe and began adopting children. She adopted a child from Korea, another from Japan, Colombia, Finland, Morocco, Venezuela. 12 children in total, representing different races, different religions, and different continents. She called them her Rainbow Tribe. She raised them all together in her massive 15th century French chateau, Les Milans, creating a living, breathing exhibit that humanity's divisions are entirely artificial. She opened the doors of her estate to the public, essentially turning her home into a utopian theme park. Tourists would pay to come and watch the children play together in the gardens, hoping to show the world that brotherhood was possible. But utopias are incredibly expensive. The maintenance of the chateau, the staff, the travel, and the care for 12 children drained her fortune. She spent every penny she had on her family and her civil rights causes. By the late 1960s, the money completely ran out. The banks foreclosed on her estate. The woman who had given her youth to the stage, her life to France, and her fortune to civil rights was violently evicted. In 1969, photographers captured one of the most heartbreaking images of the 20th century. Josephine Baker, in her 60s, was found sitting on the wet, rain-soaked steps of her chateau. She was physically locked out of her own home, surrounded by a few stray cats and a pile of meager luggage, her children temporarily displaced. She had lost everything. Was this the final trapdoor? Was this how the most sensational woman in the world would end? Thrown back into the freezing gutter she had crawled out of 50 years ago? She went from the slums of St. Louis to the palaces of Europe, to the treacherous underground of the resistance, and finally back to the streets. Not because the world gave her a chance, but because she fought for every inch of ground she stood on. In a moment, we will look at the final impossible twist in her life, and we will extract the 3 Josephine rules, the psychological lessons of audacity that you can weaponize in your own life. But a story this powerful, a life this immense, should not be watched once and forgotten. We are building a permanent library of the world's most dangerous, brilliant, and daring minds. If you want to be in the room when the next untold story is unsealed, join the resistance. Hit the subscribe button, turn on the bell. Now, let's see how the curtain falls. Josephine Baker did not die on that wet doorstep. Princess Grace of Monaco, the very same woman who had linked arms with Josephine and walked out of the segregated Stork Club 2 decades earlier, stepped in. Grace arranged a villa in Monaco for Josephine and her children, saving them from homelessness. And in 1975, at 68 years old, Josephine staged one final spectacular comeback. To celebrate her 50 years in show business, she opened a revue at the Bobino Theater in Paris. The opening night was a massive, glittering triumph. The audience was packed with royalty and celebrities, including Mick Jagger and Sophia Loren. Josephine commanded the stage with the exact same electricity she had in the 1920s. She received a deafening standing ovation that lasted for minutes. The reviews the next morning declared she was better than she had ever been. 4 days later, she suffered a cerebral hemorrhage. She died peacefully, her bed surrounded by newspapers praising her final triumph. She went out on the absolute top. When we look back at the architecture of her life, 3 distinct psychological lessons emerge. Lesson 1: the weaponization of perception. The Nazis looked at Josephine and saw only a beautiful dancer. They dismissed her mind entirely. Josephine understood that other people's prejudices are their greatest weakness. In your own life, what people think of you is often intended to be a cage. Josephine showed us it can be a shield. If the world drastically underestimates you, let them. Do not correct them. It gives you the dark, unmonitored space you need to operate and build your empire. Lesson 2: radical reciprocity. Josephine owed the nation of France nothing, yet she offered it her life. Why? Because France gave her the one thing America violently refused to: dignity. She taught us that loyalty is not about where you were born, it is about who sees your soul. Her rainbow tribe proved that family is a conscious choice, not a biological default. You owe your allegiance to the people and places that let you be whole. Lesson 3: the power of unapologetic excellence. Every single time the world said no, Josephine did not argue. She performed. She didn't politely ask for permission to integrate the theaters of America. She made her act so undeniable, so culturally vital, that the theaters had to change their racist laws just to have her. She proved that unapologetic excellence is the ultimate form of protest. You don't beat the system by complaining about it, you beat it by outgrowing it.